welcome to the GS session on death anxiety. Very nice of you to join us today. And here I am about to introduce myself. Hi, so my name is Catherine Ooi, and I'm the Executive Director of Kaseh Hospice Foundation. I'm the Vice Chairman as well of the Malaysian Hospice Council and a partner and co-founder of the Empowerment Group, or TEG. We run a mental health service provider in 4 countries. That would be Malaysia, Singapore.
Sorry, I wanted to let in Arman and I muted you, so you have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Okay, so was I muted? Should I start again?
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right, no worries. Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's GES Death Anxiety workshop. And death anxiety and how it's secretly running the show behind closed doors in your own subconscious. So we're looking into concepts about what death anxiety is, how you subconsciously and consciously react to death anxiety, and some of the things you can do about it. That's for discussion coming right up. So a little bit about me. My name is Catherine Ooi. I'm the Executive Director of Kaseh Hospice Foundation. That is a hospice in Malaysia, in Selangor to be precise. We are the 2nd biggest hospice in Malaysia. I'm also the Vice Chairman of the Malaysian Hospice Council, a partner and co-founder of the Empowerment Group, or TEG. We are a mental health services and training provider in 4 countries. That would be Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. I'll leave my email later, so if you have any questions about any of these things, you can get in touch with me. I'm also a consultant and advocate. I'm a certified Deaf Doula and the founder of the Deaf Cafe in Malaysia. And my focus areas are, as you can guess, palliative care, deaf literacy, grief and loss, and all issues of death and dying, including existentialism and death anxiety, which is the topic we will be talking about today. So this morning, we are going to talk about death anxiety and why it is often uncomfortable, painful, or anxiety-inducing to talk about or to even think about death. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how death anxiety shows up in our lives. And is there really an answer to managing death anxiety, or is it something inevitable, just something we have to live with our entire lives? And what is the significance of that? So just think of today's session as a philosophy class. You're just absorbing new schools of thought, new notions, theories from different experts. So it's an exploratory session. We have a bit of didactic because we have to bring up the theories. But after that, it's just for sharing. And if you have questions, we really, really welcome that. Okay, so a small activity is to just pick one visual, any visual, that makes you think about death. So how you relate to death and what you think of it. You can pick any visual you like.
Number 5.
I see a 5 here. You can put that in your chat. So we've got 2 5s. That's very, very interesting. And actually quite rare. So I think we've got some rare people in the room with it's a very imaginative picture, isn't it? Very evocative. And if you want to talk about why you picked that picture, do put that in the chat as well. And here's some questions to ask yourself while you're looking at that picture. What kind of thoughts and visual did you get when you were looking at it, when you were picked number 5? Yeah. And when you were looking at it, how did your body feel? We can go back to the pictures here. How did it feel in your body when you've got your mind when you were thinking about death, and it's going to be a conceptual attraction to a certain picture. But how did your body feel when you looked at that same picture? We have afraid. So, okay, and we have fear as well. So what we can see here is a lot of people relating, well, a lot of people in this room relating to death, sort of in a negative way, and that's perfectly understandable, given you're getting a picture like this, and it's nothing terribly familiar, is it? It has a huge unknown element in it. Especially if you pick 5, I think probably one of the most mysterious visuals that you identify with. So, and the resulting emotion, the resulting feeling in your body, which I really invite you to sit with and explore and try to have a conversation with yourself, so that you get to know this aspect of yourself is a very important part of understanding your own relationship with death. And also looking at, which visual that you like and dislike. For some, it would be if a visual is creepy, like 5. I actually have a lot of feedback where 5 is the visual they dislike the most. And I also have a lot of people who say 5 is the visual that they feel most represent death to them. Yeah. And also, just a question to leave with you. What would you think if you thought about, I like this visual best, I dislike this visual the most? What would you think of somebody who picked a visual you didn't like, that you really disagreed with, but they liked that the most? It's just something to think about, and also to relate to the fact that we all think about death, relate to it very intensely, very quickly. It's almost a primal choice in the way you relate to something. And we also feel a certain way about people who do it very differently from ourselves. So what is death anxiety and why is it important? Let's start with an academic definition, even though that's a little bit boring. We'll look at death anxiety being more about the conscious and unconscious states that result when you feel threatened by death. So as you see just now when you were picking those visuals, how did you feel? You felt that fear. You felt that slight discomfort that, oh, why are we even thinking about this? We should be looking at happy things only, or isn't it a bit dangerous maybe to even go deep into our own fears in this way? So the death anxiety is something that arises, and that exercise you just did, that's a very small, sort of almost a warm-up session for you to get to know your own death anxiety. What is really within you, deep in your subconscious. So death anxiety is conscious or unconscious psychological states that arise when you feel threatened by death, or when you remember the finiteness of your own life. And it is a common phenomena in all societies. It arises in all sorts of ways, as we will look into later. But it is our very unique shared human trait that we all have. And there's nobody that does not have death anxiety in some shape or form. So what is denial of death? When humans rose to an awareness of mortality, and this was a very, very long time ago, we have all the history of man's life through the years that show us that the minute we became conscious of who we are, we have started to produce narratives of death. We have needed to come to terms with ideas of death and dying. And to be cognizant of life is to also be cognizant of death. But what happens in daily living is that we are only cognizant of life, and we shuttle our cognizance of death into the back of our subconscious, where it does beneficial or unbeneficial things depending on your personality and who you are, your superstitions and what you fear. So bringing death, the denial of death, the fear of death, our existential knowledge of our own finity helps us to look at how it affects us and what we can do about it. So in the short span of time that we've looked at death, that we have been conscious and sentient, we've evolved a singular mechanism to deal with death, which is to deny it. And this is what we do on a daily basis. It's a habit we have in order to sort of get on with our daily duties. So death anxiety is anxiety caused by thought of one's own death. In its extreme form, when it becomes a phobia, when it starts to really ruin your life, is known as thanatophobia, so the fear of death. And you'll see later, it's far more prevalent than one would think. It's got many theories that includes the famous ones are, of course, Freud and Erik Erikson. But it's important. An entire body of philosophy and theories have developed to help us understand how death anxiety relates to the human psychology and the things we do. And that's what we're looking at today. So we'll start with Robert Langs, and he proposed 3 different causes of death anxiety. The first 2 are quite similar. One is called the predatory death anxiety. So that means if you feel you're in danger, that anxiety rises up. It's sort of a fight or flight response. It's meant to keep you safe. And the COVID time pandemic, for example, is a very good example of predatory death anxiety, when you fear for your life, when you fear for your safety. And it's meant to keep you safe, really. Predator's death anxiety is the anxiety that arises when you are the predator. So this would be to people who are about to commit acts of violence, a psychopath, a murderer, for example. It's not that they don't feel fear. In fact, fear rises up, and it's called a predator's death anxiety. And it still comes, very interestingly, from fear of death. But the way of them dealing with it is to commit that violence, that killing, for example. But the one we are most concerned with, and the one everybody will be most familiar with, is existential death anxiety. So this stems from the basic knowledge that life will end, and so will I one day. So existential death anxiety, according to Robert Langs, is the most powerful form of death anxiety. And this is what follows us through day to day and empowers a lot of our choices, thoughts, decisions, and emotions and subliminal thinking. And here we have another terror management theory. And he says that, this is Ernst Becker, and he says that death anxiety is not only real, but it is the most profound source of concern for humans. And the minute humans grow up to a certain age and sort of develop a sort of mortality salience, and what that means is your awareness of your own mortality starts to sharpen, becomes more sophisticated. With it, when that arises, what follows up and arises with it is existential anxiety. When you realize you're mortal and life is finite, anxiety rises together with it. Life is finite. What do I do? What does it all mean? And he explains that sometimes that anxiety is so intense, it turns into phobia. The phobia of being alone, the phobia of being left alone, the phobia of confined spaces shows up in a variety of ways. And to Ernst Becker, through the terror management theory, most daily behavior are attempts actually to deny death and to regulate anxiety. So something quite scary here is the notion really that our own mortality, knowing of our mortality, William James called it the worm at the core of human existence. Just a really, really scary way of how people end up relating to the terror of mortality. This sort of thing that's working at the back of your head and you don't even know where it is, where it's sitting on your body. For example, while you're listening to this, and I do hope that because it can be triggering a topic like this for some of the listeners here today, that you will be very, very gentle with yourself. And if something is too uncomfortable, be ready to walk away or put me on mute for a while, or just come back to the YouTube recording another day and slowly go through it, because different people relate to the death at different point of their lives very, very differently. And ultimately, the fact that you're even here, the fact that you're even choosing to listen to this death anxiety, it's very confronting. And do be gentle with yourself. Because it's very courageous of you to even be here today, to even have that curiosity and that desire to explore. And that is the steps you take towards sort of going deep into yourself and getting to know yourself. So in what ways do we avoid our fear of death? Yeah, I've talked very, very briefly about the mortality salience. So that is the range is like a sliding scale of our awareness of the inevitability of our own death, the death of others as well. So some of the examples of how we end up fearing death is the most common, I think, in Asian societies especially, is just refusing to talk about death. You know, when somebody brings it up, we shut it down. We don't allow society to talk about it. We don't allow exploration or learning about it. It's just a very, very uncomfortable space. And like I work in a hospice line, so we see the results, the net results of avoiding death until the end of life. And it's very, very painful, because then you have to confront all your fears, all your existential terror, right at a time when you shouldn't be doing it, at the end of life. And that's very, very painful indeed. So refusing to talk about death, to have that conversation, wanting to see it as something very, very negative, when it really is not. It is a fact of life. But if we choose to tar it in a certain brush and say this is something we don't deal with at all, then that's an obvious sign of a very big fear of death. Getting agitated or angry when taboo topics are discussed as well. Phobia development, so that includes superstitions, symbolic associations, so black dogs, black cats, you know, just seeing something and using it to represent death, so that you can put your fear into it and think, if I can avoid this thing, then I will avoid death or thinking about death. So it can also lead to very extreme actions, and that includes looking for immortality, looking for, how do I prolong my life? How do I stop what I fear from happening? Okay. And let's stop and have a mini discussion. In what ways do you avoid the fear of death? What do you think you do? And if you're at home, or you're watching this through YouTube, you can just pause the video for a while and just scribble a few things about what you think you do. What do you think your habits are? And we all have habits to avoid the fear of death, to sort of deny it from happening. Yeah. So Andrea says she occupies herself. And that's very common. I do that. I do that as well. And this is something we all face. So really, I hope you draw comfort from the fact that there is no one alive, and no human person on this earth that do not fear death. We can say we don't, and that's a mean of dealing with it, because as I said, with death anxiety comes all these mechanisms we develop over many centuries, long years, ourselves, that are personal to ourselves as well, to deal with death anxiety. So yeah, so a lot of people say they occupy themselves, you know, if any sort of subliminal inkling starts to come out, if we see someone else who's who has, like, for example, recently lost somebody, that's part of the reason why grief and loss is so uncomfortable for so many people, because underlying grief and loss is the subliminal fear of death. So thank you for the answers. Yes, and really, for those at home watching on YouTube, I really encourage you, if you can, just pause the video, make a comprehensive list, as comprehensive as you dare. And I would say that the more you go into it, the more you will discover how it shows up in your life for you. Yeah, and Andrea says, for me, it's coming from the fact that I'm so lively and life is so beautiful. It makes me so afraid of losing. And that's really, really a valid fear. That we have so much we love here, and does death mean that it is going to be taken away from it? Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That is very vulnerable and very honest. So what some of the other ways that we look into that, how we escape the fear of death, would be unwillingness to plan our end of life. So in my industry, for example, we see that a lot. And of course, people in insurance or in estate planning will tell you that it is often very, very painful for somebody to think about wrapping up their affairs and putting things in order. And some people can do it, and it's not so painful for them. But for some people, it is, and one of the, it comes out as a crisis, you know, for someone to think like, I have to give all this up one day. It also comes out as anxiety, as hypochondria. So, you know, just a thinking that we're sick. And the opposite of that as well, which is complete disregard of care of self. So on one hand, death anxiety, so it almost comes in two opposite spectrum. On one hand, death anxiety creates that sort of fear of death. So you keep looking for symptoms that you're sick. And you keep going to a doctor and saying, you know, test me. I think I have this. I'm pretty sure I feel like this way in the middle of the night. I wake up with palpitations, etc., etc. So that's hypochondria. But the opposite is also a form of death anxiety, which is when you just don't care anymore. Because caring, because the polarity, the pooling of the two tension between what I fear and why would I care for something that I'm going to lose at the end is there. And what this reveals of the person is that they can't deal with that polarity. They cannot sit in the same place with this polarity. So the answer to that is to just not have any self-care at all. And it's very, very sad actually, but if we can sort of catch ourselves doing it, then we can slowly go to a little bit more to the center, where we're a lot more gentle to ourselves. We hold the idea of death in our minds, and we hold it to the point where we are not to say we can get into bed with it, but we are a little bit more comfortable, and we use it to empower us rather than to drive us into a frenzy of fear and anxiety. And yeah, so panic disorder happen as well. Such a frequent worry about having a heart attack, etc. Existential terror, body dysmorphia, pain disorders. You know, a lot of this falls under the hypochondria schism. So it's more of, you look at your body, especially maybe as you look at your body change throughout life, you kind of start to go, oh my gosh, these are changes. These are changes that signify that my time is running out. And disorders can actually arise from that if we're not careful. So a very extreme form of death anxiety, if we don't check it, if we cannot relate to the nature inevitably, and like relate gracefully to the fact that our lives are finite, then the danger is some of these can arise as a result. Inability to be alone as well. I think we all start at some point of time when we start our mortality salience. Usually when we become a little bit more aware of death and dying, for a lot of people, they start to realize I'm a bit afraid of being alone. I don't really like it. I feel a bit uncomfortable because there's some subliminal fear. I can't really put it into words. But what it actually is the fear of death and dying. So the need to fill in space with distractions, and sort of, and this is very very common actually in society, equating death with terror or horror. So just putting a very, very negative connotation to it, because once we put that negative connotation, we have a good reason to avoid it. And just think about that for a moment. Just let it sit with you. When we put a really negative title on something like death and dying, we have a good excuse to avoid it. Then you can justify all your fear, or your hiding, or your paranoias, or your phobias, because you've labeled it in this way. I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm just going to leave it there. And because ultimately what we'll come to find is that there's no real answer to how we deal with anxiety of death. And that sort of existential thing is something we have to sit with. So how we think about it in our minds is ultimately what is most important. And we have to ask ourselves, when I equate death with great terror, great horror, great negativity, how much am I helping myself, seeing that sooner or later I have to face my death? I'll just leave that there. So going down the list, we get a sense of powerlessness as well. We get loneliness, meaninglessness. And a lot of that is just that sense of when we skirt this topic, it is so unknown. It is so elusive, away from what we can feel and touch and hear, away from the material plane and our parties and our brands and our MTV channels. And it's so far from what we surround ourselves with every day as comfort, that when we first confront it, it's very common to have a big sense of powerlessness. We also have maladaptive coping strategies, avoidance. We've talked about that. At the last core of it, some theories look at suicidal ideation as being a form of fear of death as well, because rather than confront it and live with it your entire life, you start to think, how do I just leave this so that I don't have to have that existential terror? I don't have to live with that. I rather just exit. And that's, of course, the most extreme form of death avoidance. You avoid it by seeking it out. Okay, so we see that most of the common phobias have death anxiety at its very root. So fear of flying, fear of water, fear of drowning, spiders, snakes, enclosed high spaces, anything that develops as a phobia in our minds is something that can cause us great danger, causes death. And at the root of it, when you go far back enough, it is death anxiety that's rearing its head. So checking if your house is safe, if you're going to get robbed, if you're going to be electrocuted and die, all of these are means of expressing our death anxiety, but expressing it in a way that is almost disconnected. So we don't even know that is death anxiety. We avoid it to the extent we cannot tell is actually fear of death. We call it instead a fear of spiders, fear of frogs. It's very, very interesting, isn't it? And this is really something, you know, as we go through the theories, I would invite you to just look at the phobias in your life and try to sit with it and see, where is it taking you? Is it really the phobia, or is it something else? What role does the phobia serve in your life? So an extension of this is, if we are always treating the phobia, the surface problem, your fear of spiders, for example, your fear of somebody coming to your house and slitting your throat in the middle of the night, your hypochondria, if we are treating that, if that's what we're focusing on, are we addressing at all the existential concerns at the root, which is actually the fear of dying? And by only looking at the surface fear, are we failing to ensure long-term well-being in our society? Because if we never ever talk about it, if we don't even face it, and if when you look for ways to help yourself, what you end up going to is, I'm going to treat my phobia, I'm going to treat my hypochondria. Are you really addressing the real fear at the root of it? So existential philosophers, this includes Viktor Frankl, for example, is a very, very famous existential philosopher, as well as a psychiatrist and psychologist. He was also one of the people imprisoned in Auschwitz, and he wrote amazing narratives on the meaning of life and survival. And I really recommend his book, Man's Search for Meaning, for anyone remotely interested in existentialism and finding meaning. So according to existential philosophers, we look for meaning because of our awareness of death. So this is really interesting for most people, because they didn't even know that when I'm looking for meaning, when I'm looking for significance, when I'm looking for things to fill my life with, what is really happening subliminally inside me is the fear of death. And we think it's just an abstract concept that we think of every now and then, and we go, oh, okay, you know, that's enough morbid for a day. But it drives our behavior in far, far, far bigger ways than we realize. So the search for meaning, which is one of the biggest searches of existence, of being human, what meaning means to us personally, is, according to people like Viktor Frankl and all these philosophers and quite a few psychologists in existentialism, driven predominantly by death anxiety. It's our way of countering death anxiety. So finding meaning is, I would say, our favorite way of balancing up our fear of death. So according to existential philosophy, when man faces that twin road of finding meaning in life, and also knowing that he will die, this leads to two sorts of behavior. And you can have both at the same time for different things. So either it becomes negative anxiety. So for example, hypochondria is a result that arises from holding two polarities in your hand, and not being able to deal with it and dealing with it through hypochondria. Or you have positive anxiety, which is where, for example, death positivity movement, living your best life, you know, movements like this, that's positive anxiety. And this leads to a life of meaning seeking, a life of trying to live to your biggest potential, a life of trying to squeeze every drop of the day of a day out of it and appreciating what you have. So a lot of people, when they think of death anxiety, they relate it only to negative anxiety, and to a great extent that's true. If we don't shift our balance, then it probably will end up in negative anxiety, because we don't have the skills and it's not taught in school on how to deal with it. But if we look at, juggle this polarity, we can sit in it, we have the courage to hold it in our hands at the same time, then it usually leads to positive anxiety, a sort of appreciation for the scarcity of life. And that also is one of the biggest driving behaviors of mankind, and produces some of the most amazing things that humankind has done for ourselves, for each other, for the planet. So when we're looking for meaning, when we seek to live to our best potential, we are also driven by death anxiety, but it is a positive form of death anxiety. And that is a new concept for a lot of people, that idea that death anxiety can also be positive, it's not just negative. By using it to frame your life in a way that is full of potential, which looks at maximizing every single day, which looks at really tasting what you taste and really feeling what you feel, and not being afraid of that experience of being alive. I see I have a chat here. I'm just going to look into this. Okay, yeah. Yes, it's a really, really good book. And there's actually many fields of thought on this. Death anxiety is and existentialism is something that has been, humans have been concerned with it our whole lives. The modern world is, I would say, a fear-based one and a distraction-based one. So we try not to go into it. But beneath that is, many generations of philosophers, thinkers, journals, books, a lot of resource actually. If you go looking for it, now that the door is open, now you know that this exists, and you can read really the amazing things that people have looked at, and the things they've shared after going very, very deep into this field. It has a lot to offer, and I would really say it's transformative in nature, very, very life-changing. So our challenge, I would say today, is how do we turn death anxiety into positive death anxiety, especially in modern life. So we are ultimately meaning-seeking creatures, and being meaning-seeking helps us look into the heart of the great silence. And yes, we do keep ourselves busy, and that's part of daily existence. We have our duties, we have the things we do, we have our relationships, we go out and enjoy life. But sharing that space with us, the meaning of being alive, is also what I call to look into the heart of the great silence of being alive, of having that existence, and what does that mean? What does it mean to exist? And we have Karen Armstrong's quote here, which is, a very basic quote on human beings fall very easily. And I truly believe this. We fall very, very easily into despair. We are fragile. And that is why we fear this concept so much, because we fear falling into despair. We have tasted of despair. No one has escaped it before. And we do not want to willingly venture into this territory. So from the very beginning, we have invented stories to help us place our lives in a larger setting. And it boils down to the creation of meaning and value, of choosing to live our days with something that means something to us personally. And this is why it's a bit of a can of worms, and people would rather not look at it, because it's there are no real answers, you know. Talking about death is a mediation upon our own ignorance. There is no method of getting to know death better, because you get to know death upon death. So all we have is theories and how we sit with those theories. And Ludwig Wittgenstein, he's a 20th century philosopher. He says death is not an experience in life. I've always found that a very profound statement, and something I leave here for your reflection. And at the end of life, each story is different. For some, death comes suddenly, or for some, a person will just linger and fade bit by bit. For some, the body will weaken first and the mind stays alert, while for others, cognitive losses come first, and you see this in Alzheimer's, etc. But the body remains very, very strong. And we can arm ourselves with knowledge about what happens. And I truly believe this helps. But every story is going to be different at the end of life. And sitting with that and knowing, being able to be okay with that is a very big part of conquering death anxiety. So this is to me a visual I like to show everyone. Can we relate to ourselves one day sitting in a wheelchair? And it's very confronting. I will be the first to say, even for me, swimming as I do in this field, I am confronted every time I look at this. But it doesn't mean I don't look at it. It doesn't mean we avoid it. We look at it and we sit with it until the fear subsides. That's one way of doing it. And then we look at how we transform death anxiety into positive anxiety. And the truth is, we live with dying, our own death and the death of others. So what I want to leave with you is it really wise to avoid reflecting what we already live with daily, what secretly propels so much of our behavior and our subconscious thoughts? Do we really, really want to avoid this? Is this really the best path for us? And what is the consequence to society by this avoidance? Or is there a better way? This is a picture from Deaf Cafe. So that's a cafe I founded in Malaysia, but it is founded by John Underwood in London about 10 years ago. And now there are, I would say, almost 100,000 deaf cafe in many hundreds of languages. They're all over the world. I believe they're in 90 plus countries today. And it's a safe place to talk about your existential fears, to talk about death, to listen to other people talk about death, so that you can relate to it. You can see that it's a shared experience. And when an experience is shared from honesty and safety, its hold on us, its grip becomes less fearful, and it becomes more about, how do I have a dance with death? How do I make it my friend, this unknown thing? And how do I relate to it and accept it and use it to live my best life? I come today with no answers, and that's deliberate, because the journey of looking is really it sits with you. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for attending, and you can email me at katherineooi@gmail.com. Feel free to email me on anything and everything. And yes, if you have any questions, I will answer them now.
So I will just stop the live stream so that we are. Thank you very much for watching. For anyone who is watching it on the replay, then please just remember that you always can ask Catherine via Gmail and email. So just send her an email. And thank you very